Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Clifford Shannon of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and I am thrilled to welcome you back for the fall season of our virtual public program calendar. We are really very lucky to start the way we are because some of you know we opened back last November in the museum an exhibition called Revealed: The Hunt for Bin Laden. And that exhibition really depended to a very large degree on the access that we were able to get into the intelligence community, into the military operations world, that together, those two elements were responsible for this extraordinary effort that led to this mission in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And so as we delved deeper and deeper into that, of course, we learned much more about how that kind of work gets done. And it is to some degree part of the exhibition, but really it's almost an endless source of fascination and interest. And so to begin our fall program calendar, we're very fortunate to be joined by Fran Moore, and welcome, Fran. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Fran retired from the CIA in 2015 as a senior executive with 32 years of experience. I believe the last position that she held, which was from 2010 to 2014, was as Director of Intelligence, and that position is now known as Director of Analysis within the agency, which meant that she was at the top of this very large analytic pyramid within the CIA, generating the materials and understanding them and interpreting them for policymakers for a broader understanding. She had been the deputy within that unit, that department of the CIA prior to that. She also previously, and has a long experience in counterterrorism work. From 2005 to 2008, she was the head of analysis in the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, which is where the fight against Al-Qaeda and related organizations was centered. And so we will talk a little bit about the integration of analysis and operations within that very specific counterterrorism effort. She received really many awards for her exceptional service, but I want to particularly note the Presidential Rank Award, Distinguished Executive in 2013. And now Fran is president of FPM Consulting, which provides insight on the delivery of high quality intelligence and technical solutions to federal and commercial clients. So it is a slightly longer introduction than we usually give, but we have a very distinguished guest. So this is totally appropriate. Fran, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to do this. Let me start by really asking you, it's a bit into sort of a nerdy direction to get this conversation started, but talk to us about intelligence or analysis, its place within CIA and the intelligence community more broadly, and what the other elements of operations in particular are that normally are not the same as analysis. As outsiders, we think, well, spy agencies are constantly gathering material and analyzing it, but that's not all they do. And it's an interesting question for us to think about how those pieces are connected from the analytics side to the operational side.
Sure, and thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to start kind of in a CIA-centric way, but I'll talk a little bit about intelligence analysis from an intelligence community perspective also. And CIA has sort of three core missions. The first is the intelligence collection piece, the foreign intelligence collection, to either to provide insight to U.S. policymakers on issues that governments are essentially trying to hide, right? It's the secrets piece. What is it that they actively are trying to prevent the U.S. from understanding? And that collection piece is a key mission of our operations directorate. And the other key mission of that operations directorate is something called covert action, which is when the U.S. government decides it wants to influence an outcome somewhere, and it wants to not do that in a very public way. So the intent of covert action is to influence outcomes as opposed to just collect information on them. The collection side, you don't want to be discovered, But you do want the actual impact of covert action to be something that changes outcome. And of course, covert action is done at the direction of the president. So it's all done within a US policy framework. And I talk about those two first, even though I was from the Directorate of Analysis, because the analytic mission is that third core mission, and that is to provide insight to US policymakers to give them decision advantage, right? Either an opportunity to advance US interests or a warning that allows them then to take action to mitigate impact to US national interest. And that analysis that CIA does has been historically, since our inception, to provide those insights to the national customer, because the director of CIA is not a policy maker in his own right, like the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State, where their intelligence entities support policy that is directed, but they're actually working in cabinet entities that are implementing that policy. CIA is not implementing policy. So then the all-source analyst uses all of that collected foreign intelligence, not just the human that CIA collects, but signals intelligence, the imagery intelligence, all of the different ints that are out there from other collection agencies, as well as openly available information, and increasingly the vast amount of information that's available through large data sets that can be analyzed, right, to surface patterns that the humans cognitively can't see without that assistance. All of that goes into the information that analysts use to do that analysis. But that analysis isn't just what analysts believe to be interesting, right? They have to understand what policymakers are focused on, what those priorities are, and then be prepared to provide those insights in ways that help further decision-making, that's on the plate of the policymaker at that moment. Last thing I would say is that same expertise, that same analytic tradecraft is then also used inside CIA to support CIA's operations. It's also used to support the warfighter in areas where the U.S. is involved in conflict on the ground, and even law enforcement.
Let me ask, in developing this exhibition, it became clear, and this was stated by folks in the intelligence community, that one of the big impacts of 9/11 was that the intelligence community was not speaking across agency lines or even within some agencies, and that the U.S. was not best prepared to understand what the threat was and perhaps even at some point be able to preempt it. So this issue of integration seems to really plague the efforts and really needs to be built over the course of time in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And then when the US is at war in Afghanistan and Iraq, you have the even greater challenge of integrating intelligence operations with military operations. So talk to us about sort of the learning curve on how within the CIA, but also across the intelligence community and then with the military, the hard lessons of better integration were learned and applied.
Okay, I will, and I'm actually going to start in a pretty strategic place, and that goes back to the 16 intelligence entities that fall under the Director of National Intelligence's umbrella. Most of the analytic efforts and the collection efforts in those agencies really have been developed against those agencies' mission priorities. So if you look at something like the Defense Intelligence Agency, their first customer is truly the defense policymaker and the warfighter. And so that doesn't mean that they don't provide insight to national security policymakers and right for the president for the PDB, but it means that their collection streams and their expertise is executed against a very refined set of requirements for the defense policymaker. State Department, similarly, for a State Department policymaker, FBI in its law enforcement, its counterintelligence, its national security focus. And so there's a tension between executing your expertise to support that specific mission, and then integrating it across the intelligence community to make sure that that expertise and that focus, which drives collection in many cases, is shared in ways that others can use the fruits of your labor, if you will. And some of that collection is sensitive, and some of that so the methods are sensitive, the sources are sensitive, or if you're FBI, it may have been gathered in the course of an investigation that may be leading to a prosecution. So there's good reasons to want to protect its dissemination. And that's also sometimes some of the tension in sharing. And then, and now I'm going to be candid about bureaucracies. Then there's the sort of ugly arrogance that goes along with, this is for my folks, this is my rice bowl. We don't want to share with them. They don't know how to protect our information. So there's a cultural eddy that continues to flow. The DNI's establishment and their efforts to kind of integrate, I think, have helped force that information to be available. But there is a little bit of that is still, I think, at play. So what 9/11 really produced was the national security repercussions of not having tackled that in a more effective way before 9/11. And sort of has forced that kind of sharing. But sometimes it still remains that an entity may have information in its holdings and have made it available through certain sharing, but those dots just don't get connected. And so I think it continues to be an issue, and it is an issue that organizations, without constant oversight and pressure to keep the integration healthy and engaged, I think that there's risk that that kind of integration can slide back to old patterns.
We're talking now about 20 years since 9/11 and the shock of what happened then. Now, a lot has happened, of course, in the years since, and the success of integration on the battlefield is something that I assume has established a momentum of its own. But I'm very interested in this idea that there is a natural tendency to backslide, is essentially what you're saying, that, the agencies involved will sort of, over the course of time, just pull back almost naturally into their own concerns. So, what are the mechanisms that keep that integration going? Or is there a sense that we are losing that advantage we gain?
So having been retired for 5 years, I wouldn't be in the best position to talk about, whether in the here and now we've lost it. I will say that I've watched bureaucratic behavior, though, for the 32 years I was there. And I can see that in the natural course of things, the focus on your most pressing mission, which tends to be inside of your organization, could easily allow for some of that conscious attention to making sure information is flowing, can backslide. So I guess my point really is you have to be vigilant to make sure that doesn't happen, and that the nature of every organization having its own mission, as well as the need to integrate for broader missions, is something that has to be managed and led, I think, by DNI and by the senior leadership of intel organizations. There is phenomenally more information available through data layers of information in the community now than there was 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So we certainly, in the intelligence community, I think they've made steps forward that could not be completely eradicated. But some of the most pressing intelligence issues are also issues that are so sensitive that if there is a sensitive collection stream out there, there is a real tension between protecting the source of information and making it available across a community of, say, 16 intelligence entities so that analysts working the issue can have access to it, to understand it, to share with policymakers. And it's in situations like that where I think that the desire to protect sometimes comes into tension with the desire to make sure it's discoverable for the right analysts. And I think that an intelligence priority that I do believe still exists and is a high priority is to somehow create safe discovery in this vast amount of information so that the right people can see the right information.
What you're talking about here, this jumps us ahead to current moments in the intelligence community. there is a required trust that the system is going to work, the system is going to protect one another from exposure. And while the community has come under all kinds of pressure from the president, it's not really specific to the issue we're discussing here, but I wonder if in this general environment of challenging the intelligence community because it's doing its job, but not coming up with the conclusions that are necessarily preferred, that really affects trust in a way that does have an impact on the kinds of concerns that you're expressing.
So at one level, there's an acculturation when you become a member of the intelligence community about needing to sort of, what's the right way to say this? It's the professionalism, I think, that is acculturated from early on, which is the apolitical approach. And there will always be some public discourse on whether you've got it right, whether you've got it wrong, whether you've been useful or not. So, and I can tell you that it is a painful place to be when your area of expertise is being discussed in a negative way publicly. So whether it's for analysts who work terrorism after the RDI program was made public, or analysts working Iraq after Iraq WMD, analysts working the Arab Spring when there was great discussion over whether there was an intelligence failure there or not. There's some level of that we literally teach and mentor within the culture, that you have to just keep your head down and keep your focus on mission. So in the conversations I've had with folks, I have a sense that the leadership is very much in the intelligence community, especially those who are career intelligence officers, keeping the workforce focused on the very important intelligence work that needs to get done. And I've heard people like Sue Gordon talk about her experiences where she's, said that was very much the focus of leadership in the IC, which is we have an important job to do. And this sort of thing is, this may be a little bit more intense than some of us have experienced, but this is common. But at another level, I worry that when the entire bureaucracy is sort of feeling under attack to some degree and is concerned about policy, that there is a psychology of leaking information or sharing information publicly, that sometimes there's a mindset that you can rationalize it's okay to do it because this and this and this is wrong in what's going on in our policy discourse right now. And that anyone who's worked counterintelligence issues, worries that when intelligence itself becomes such a political issue, that you're going to potentially have officers who rationalize decisions that way. So I do think that when it comes to the issue of trust, analysts and all intelligence officers, for the most part, I think are probably very focused on getting the job done, but it creates an environment where those who may have for other reasons feel disgruntlement or aggravation, it may be one more issue that pushes them in directions that are counter to U.S. national security, which is sharing sensitive information. And it is exacerbated when there's a sense that that kind of information at more senior levels of government may be being shared.
You may not want to comment on this, and we're getting maybe a little bit ahead of ourselves, but there was a report last week in Politico that Vice President Biden, in the event that he wins the election, is actually very much focused on the strengthening and the reconstruction to some degree of the intelligence community, because in his view of the damage that's been done by the political pressure that's been put on it.
So, there to some degree, there's a reset whenever there's a change in administration. Priorities are different, focus is different. And there's a leadership challenge inside the intelligence community as to how you get the workforce to change direction. So you have a administration for whom, say, climate change is a top priority, and then you have an administration for whom climate change is not. You have an administration for whom energy policy is a major priority, and an administration for whom energy policy is not. So you have these cadre that have been working on something that may have been high profile that suddenly is less of a high profile. You have very different ways of absorbing information, a different battle rhythm and cadence of the meetings. So there's a lot of change between administrations, even in more typical sort of historical transitional times. I think the added layer now is sort of the sense of combativeness publicly, vis-a-vis the intelligence community, and whether or not there does need to be some additional support. And I suspect that the folks that will be in the best position to advise a new administration would be those who have been working for the past 4 years and could put their finger on anything that is more anomalous in this case than in any transition. And it's hugely different sometimes working for one administration to another administration. And it takes a while for the bureaucracy to make that shift. So CIA spends a lot of time teaching analysts in tradecraft classes that, overnight something that may not have been important becomes important, or one president reads and one president wants to hear it orally, and it's not up to us to sort of convince the incoming administration that these old ways of doing business are the best ways of doing business. It's really up to us to adapt to what they need. So I do think that any incoming administration, or even a reelection of the current administration, probably would want to pay some attention to that kind of a reset. But certainly a major change in administration, we'll probably want to find out exactly whether there are issues there that would, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this, but ultimately they want to get off the ground with the right information and in front of them to help inform their decision making. Any engagement that they feel necessary, should be informed by the people that are leading there now.
Got it. Let me just remind our audience, or let our audience know, that if you'd like to submit a question, click on the blue chat bubble at the bottom of the page, and we'll try to get those in as we continue the conversation with Fran. Let me back up a little bit, because I'm particularly interested in talking to you about your time as Chief of Analytics within the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Mm-hmm. That center was strengthened and built up in order to concentrate the agency's efforts in the war against al-Qaeda, and then beyond that in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when we spoke earlier, it was interesting to hear from you this idea that integration, even within CIA, of operational and analytic capacities did not really come all that automatically, that there was work to be done even inside of this counterterrorism center, which relies to an extraordinary degree on the analysis of intelligence, mm-hmm. to act. So talk about what that was like and why that was difficult. So
the Counterterrorism Center at CIA back in the 1980s was one of the first places where with analysts with sort of their all-source tradecraft backgrounds went to work in many respects to support the operational piece. And so the integration prior to the embassy bombings in '98 and then 9/11 was very integrated in some ways. But those analysts literally have been seconded to operational centers, and while they still did the occasional policy support piece, a lot of them were very focused on the operational piece, and so they were literally inside that operational tent. After 9/11, the recognition that the agency needed to really scale up all of its resources meant that a much larger chunk of analysts moved in, some of whom had not been working terrorism at all. They'd been working in Europe. They'd been working in crime and narcotics. Some of them had a more operational targeting focused background, and targeting is literally using your analytic skills to create leads, right, to support operations, either collection or some kind of disruptive action. And so what you imported in sort of very traditional views analytically from the analytic side about, well, we write for the president, but we don't do much on the operational side. And you imported in from the operational side, there's a pretty firm line between what operations folks do and what analysts do. So folks that hadn't actually been working the issue inside the counterterrorism center prior to 9/11 were operating sort of on their on the more bifurcated mission focus of the traditional agency at the time. So it took a while for that to actually get broken down. And that's not to say, though, that there were not analysts, from the beginning, especially on core Al-Qaeda, highly embedded in, but other parts of that same office, when I got there in 2005, had analysts that were restricted from all access to operational information, which collected primarily to support operations, not for dissemination, for analysis for the broader intelligence community. And so it took, literally took years, I think, for it to get to a place where analysts were really fully integrated into the agency's operations. At the same time that you had sort of the hunt for, Al-Qaeda leadership, not just UBL, but the hunt for Al-Qaeda leadership between 2001 and say 2005-06. You also had the WMD Commission and the results of that sort of, establishing the DNI, right? So that was a combination of 9/11 and Iraq WMD, the decision to establish a DNI separate from CIA.
And just a director of national intelligence.
Right, that director of national intelligence, and very specifically the National Counterterrorism Center, where the intelligence reform legislation put the responsibility for strategic analysis primarily with the National Counterterrorism Center. So in some respects, like the DNI coordinates intelligence analysis across the 16 agencies, the NCTC is responsible for integrating it from all of the agencies that are doing the work, very much specific to their mission. And so there was also the establishment of the NCTC, and in addition to supplying a tremendous amount of analytic talent to stand it up, sort of figuring out the best way to work together at a time when CIA had analysts embedded in operations, but still had a voice in informing US policymakers on intelligence analysis. So you had this big bureaucratic upheaval and questions about how engaged analysts should be in policy support as well as operational support. And then by the mid-2000s, you had a resurgent Al-Qaeda senior leadership. You had nodes in Al-Qaeda and the Levant, and in Iraq, the Levant and Yemen. You had increased attacks and attack planning in Europe, and so this sort of sense of the spread of the vision for a caliphate, all taking place, and honestly, Hezbollah and Iran supporting attacks on U.S. servicemen in Iraq. So terrorism at that time was complex, multifaceted, globally more of a threat to U.S. and to Western interests. And so with every threat, there are more operations, and those operations needed analysts to support them. So honestly, the threat, this is a long way of saying the threat and the demand helped drive the integration, because the threat was evolving, becoming more complex, and analysts helped at both a strategic level to understand the change, but at that tactical level to actually support the work.
Let me ask about failure, because you alluded to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was the conclusion of the intelligence community. And there was, some disagreement within the intelligence community, but nonetheless, that was the conclusion. So let me ask you about lessons learned from that. First off, in your view, was that conclusion about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq unduly influenced politically by the White House and their interest, as it's been reported in different sources, of the war, of going to war in Iraq? Was the intelligence hit that way? But also, what was the failure and what was learned from that failure?
So I'm actually going to go back for just a second to the discussion we were having about bureaucracies sliding back into old patterns if there's not vigilance. With analysis, it's somewhat the same, in the sense that a lot of the mistakes that we made, if you go back to the Iran, sort of the fall of the Shah in Iran, it's the framework through which we're assessing the information. We haven't challenged our assumptions. We've discarded information that is contradictory to our framework. We make a big mistake. It has adverse implications for US national security. We go back and we discover those lessons learned and we train to try to avoid them. And then in the day-to-day business of doing the work, the same mindset and cognitive traps that, that lead to that kind of a mistake in the past lead us to a mistake in the future. So to some degree, what we saw with, with Iraq WMD was the same kinds of issues we had, with Iran. We had something called a sort of a slide into from possibility to probability without a lot of new information to strengthen the judgment. Analysts sort of, their framework was so wired to understand the bits and pieces of information that were coming in. Saddam had a program in the past. When it was discovered, after the first Gulf War, it was discovered he'd made more progress than analysts had assessed at the time. Analysts don't like making mistakes, and so they were hyper vigilant to not make that mistake again. And so they were discounting other explanations for what those aluminum tubes might be. So the assumption was he'd had a program before, he'd gotten further than we thought he'd gotten before. Now we assume that he wants a program again. We have sources telling us he wants a program again. And now everything that comes in begins to be interpreted in terms of how it fits into the program instead of whether it fits into the program.
But is that assessment pushed by pressure from above, from the political level in your experience?
So pushed in the sense of people are telling us to write X? No. But if, the dynamism of our analytic work is the more policy interest there is, some of our best work is also produced because policymakers are trying to make hard decisions, trying to understand something difficult, and they're asking us questions constantly. So we dig a little bit more, we collect a little bit more, we understand a little bit more, and we provide them that information. That is the dynamic that actually drives just-in-time, high-quality intelligence analysis. So you can't blame the customer for asking questions. I did not work it personally, but I never had a sense from the analysts who worked it that they felt pressured to make that judgment. They truly believed they had the intelligence case at the time. And there were mistakes on the collection side. The vetting of the asset, Curveball, who's well known, the vetting of that asset, just like analysts don't necessarily want to consider information that upends their framework for making sense of the ambiguous. Collectors sometimes don't want to lose the source, whose information has been so reliable and or perceived as reliable in the past. So just like analysts discount the contradictory piece of information, people who vet the sources can sometimes get the same mindset issue and discount the information. And so we had issues with the quality of the information that analysts were not fully aware of when they were doing the analysis. And even when they became aware of it, it's hard to let go of that framework. And so, and that is the framework that led us to the conclusions we drew on Iran, 30 years before. So we spend a lot of time trying, and this is really relevant to the hunt to UBL because as we were pulling that circumstantial case together, fresh on, or very much in the forefront of all of our minds were how could we be wrong about this? Let's red team it again, not just for the credibility to the customer that we've done our homework and sort of checked our assumptions, but not wanting to steer policymakers down a path that could have very adverse national security consequences.
And I do want to come back to this issue of the shadow of failure and how that weighed on the, how that covered the decision-making or the analytics of the bin Laden case. But let's back up a little bit as we talk about that, because you are in a critical position as this material, the intelligence leads, come in. And so I'm interested in knowing, so you're running the analytics in 2010, and it was at that point, the middle of the year, towards the second half of the year, that the link to these specific couriers is uncovered. So take us back to how you learned about this, what your assessment of those first leads was. Was this something you saw as promising or just more of same? And what was done to really try to flesh this out under the pressure of the leadership of the agency, but also, of course, at some point with the White House looking over your shoulders?
So, I had been actually the director and the deputy director of the Office of Terrorism Analysis from 2005 to 2008, as you mentioned. And so I was very aware of the vectors that the analysts had looked at in 2005, 2006, when basically we said, look, the trail's cold. We need to figure out another way to come at this. And a lot of analytic aids, targeting tools, tools that allowed analysts to build in minutes networks of individuals that would have taken days to construct by hand, doing research the old-fashioned way, had come online. And so the ability to sift through old information and compare it to new information and array it in ways they could understand had revolutionized in the 5 years between 9/11 and sort of 2006, when I guess the realization that we weren't necessarily going to hear someone talking in a communication or get a human asset that could tell us exactly where bin Laden was. So how else could we come at this? And I was briefed shortly after I came into the Office of Terrorism Analysis on a new methodology they had put together, which in retrospect seems very, not surprising, no kidding. But they had basically said, look, we think if we systematically focus on family members who might be with him, videos that he's making, communications with senior leadership and the couriers, because we know his operational security is such that he's relying on a human being to carry for him. If we do it in a systematic way, we may be able to uncover a lead that would allow us to determine where bin Laden is. And so, I had kind of followed that effort. Well, first, while I was in the office, but even when I moved up to the leadership of the directorate, and was sort of aware of the efforts. But, for example, in 2007, getting a true name for the courier, the relevance of the reassessment of the information, and very prominent detainees trying to deflect attention to the courier. So I knew that there were some exciting leads, but suddenly in 2009, 2010, the identity of with the combination of the true name and the phone number was beginning to sort of really raise the hope, right, that we might be able to detect where he was. So I was aware sort of that operationally of what was happening to try to collect on it, but the real breakthrough obviously was when a human asset on the ground. So up until then, there was a lot of analytic work to put pieces together. And then in the 2009, 2010 timeframe, actual operational efforts to collect more, working with the National Security Agency, working with NGA, and then we're working literally with human beings on the ground to track started to come into play. And it was in August of 2010 when the courier used his phone and an asset was able to track him back to the Abbottabad compound. So I was reading my morning intelligence briefing that morning, very early in the morning, and an internal analytic assessment that kind of laid out the tracking back to this compound and the significance of the height of the walls and and how unusual it was, appeared in my my book, and I read it, with great interest, and was very excited, but at the same time recognized that the 4 sentences in the front were a lot more exciting in terms of the certitude maybe of who might be in that compound than what was actually in the body of the product. Something along the lines of, best lead ever to bin Laden. And then, which made you feel like there was going to be something that was very, very specifically positive, that it's clearly bin Laden, and then the actual details of what was observed. So I called the analytic manager and said, hey, look, these internal analytic assessments that I'm looking at right now have a way of getting downtown, have a way of getting, the director's going to see this. I'm going into his briefing in 10 minutes. The tradecraft has to be impeccable on this. You guys are really at a place now where you may be onto something that we've never seen before, but we cannot afford to undercut your credibility or oversell this in any way. So, we really need to be careful with the tradecraft. And I'm like, I'll look at every one of these before it goes forward, if necessary, to make sure that we don't have this much daylight between a summary and the content again. And then I was like, oh, but this is so exciting. I can't believe it, because I understood why it was important. But in that instant, I also understood why from here on in, anything you write on this is going to be scrutinized and scrutinized. And if we oversell this, either we will oversell it and lose credibility, or we could have action well before, in advance of it being appropriate. So, I say from then on, I think that was the watchword analytically on everything that they did. And they did a wonderful job. I mean, I was not in every meeting downtown. I was in most of the meetings inside the building, but not downtown. And they were always very explicit about what we knew, what we didn't know, and the fact that this was, even up to the last minute, always a circumstantial case.
It is something, I think a number of the comments we got referred particularly to one of the senior folks in the Counterterrorism Center, who I gather was always cautious in terms of holding back from making the final conclusion. But let me ask, as the momentum for this gathered, and I imagine momentum itself has an impact on how you're thinking about all of this. Where were you in terms of conviction that this was bin Laden, as the president and the intelligence community was approaching the decision moment? I know some of the analysts were very convinced. Others were more in the 50-50 range. The president says in our exhibition and elsewhere, this is a 50-50 proposition. You're never going to know until you're there. But where were you in terms of thinking about the reality that this was bin Laden?
So there were a couple of meetings where literally, the discussion of what percent confident are you? The one that really stands out for me, I can't remember if it was late November or early December, but it was in Director Panetta's office. And that's where literally the range of confidence levels that you laid out were there. And everyone was, that was from 55% that I recall to 95%. And the closer you got to the analyst doing the work, the higher the percentage was. And I remember as a senior officer, my number was actually a little bit higher than some of the other senior officers in the room, but I came in at 70%. And I said, look, normally a 70% analytic judgment, if I was looking at, say, a national intelligence estimate on Iraq, would be full of signals intelligence, human reporting with high reliability that we would be able to point to. But in this case, we had done an enormous amount of work to get to the point where we could identify the courier and follow that Suzuki Jeep back to Abbottabad. We had done a tremendous amount of work to see what was going on in that compound, to see the pacer, to observe the pattern of life that was peculiar in that compound. And, we had that summer before we followed him back, we had the courier having a conversation with a colleague somewhere else in the world, talking in a very sort of ambiguous way about working with his, former friends or something along those lines. So we had enough information, I think, to have the best circumstantial case we could make. And having watched other leads, having worked terrorism directly at a more working level, having watched us pull and pull and pull and have all of those threads literally pull out and come out with the other end, looking at it going, this isn't taking us anywhere. The more we pulled, the more this mystery unraveled, right? So that led me to a 70% level of confidence. But as I've reflected back on it, there's a lot of things in my life that with a 70% confidence level, I would not choose to do. So I still have great admiration for the policy decisions, based on the fact that we could not give them photograph with facial recognition. We could not give them DNA. We couldn't give them a reliable source human being that could attest to who was in that compound.
Yeah, no, it was a risk, and it was because of the stakes with Pakistan. It was an extraordinarily bold risk in many ways, and it turned out that not only was bin Laden there, but the possibility of a rupture with Pakistan because of what we did sending the SEALs in, that didn't happen either. How much of the assessment that you recall was focused on what Pakistan would do once we breached their national sovereignty?
So, we, I think, worried about that from the minute there was enough information on the table for there to be a policy discussion about what to do. We then began to worry about what the Pakistan reaction would be, what Al-Qaeda more broadly's reaction would be. We even had to really ask the question, what's the world's reaction going to be? Because, we would be violating another country's sovereignty to undertake this operation. So, it was a very serious consideration. If you remember, we were still very heavily involved in the war in Afghanistan. Supply lines through Pakistan were critical. But even at a more strategic level, while there was still, Al-Qaeda core, leadership in the federally administered tribal areas, plotting, but also there were Islamic militant organizations that were not directly linked to Al-Qaeda in Pakistan who had adopted the Al-Qaeda sort of ideology to the extent of attacks on the West. So, you had Pakistani Tariqa-Talabani militants that were doing homeland attacks in that period, in the 2010 period. So we needed the cooperation of the Pakistan government on counterterrorism, and then strategically, Pakistan's a nuclear power. So there were a lot of considerations on the importance of that relationship vis-a-vis specifically bin Laden. Without, at least in my recollection, there was never any consideration that we didn't need to do something on bin Laden. I think Director Panetta has been very public about his perspective that, what do you do if, we think we found bin Laden and we're not acting, So it was a difficult policy dilemma watching it, and happy that I was providing the insight, to help make decisions, but not having to make the decision myself, because I didn't see how you couldn't take action. And yet other actions seemed more fraught. The more people who knew, the more countries who might be aware, the greater the risk of flight. And so, but yes, the Pakistan question was asked repeatedly. And like I said, it was bigger than just Pakistan, it was world reaction. And as a result, tremendous care and consideration given to not just the raid itself, but how we conducted ourselves afterwards, and how, how we conduct, what was done in the event of a death and of bin Laden's death and everything else was very carefully assessed for its risks.
It's really helpful, and thank you, because I think you framed it really, really well. Even when you want to do something, and even when you have evidence that this is the place where you can do it, the consequences are enormous, and even success carries enormous risks with it. So that, yes, it was a success and going in, getting bin Laden and getting out, but that doesn't mean that the Pakistanis would automatically have reacted the way that they did. There are a number of questions that have come in, and we're going to jump around a little bit if you don't mind. First, thank you for your service. Our first questioner writes, and for coming here today. Given the very public criticism, this question goes, of the US intelligence community by the administration over the past few years, do you believe that this criticism has directly led our adversaries, Russia, Iran, China, to take action against US interests that they otherwise might not have done?
Specifically, the criticism of intelligence, I'm not sure. I think that US adversaries, in particular, say Russia, President Putin looks for opportunities, so I think that more broadly, trends in the world, polarization of politics, more domestic focus and less international collaboration among, say, the West and Europe, the Europe and the US, COVID-19, all of the developments of the last 4 years, and in maybe US preoccupation with itself to some degree. That's the kind of broader strategic environment during which adversaries look to take advantage of a US preoccupation or a Western preoccupation. So I don't know that any of our adversaries have been particularly successful doing anything vis-a-vis the US because of the president's perspective on the intelligence community or its value, which, at many levels he says he values, and then there will be criticisms of specific things. And I don't believe, again, I believe in the professionalism of the individuals doing the work. I still think everyone's going in and doing their best every day to protect national security. So I can't see it in that narrow context. I can see in a broader national security context that there have been events in the last 4 years that have opened the way for adversaries maybe to look for ways to exploit fissures in relationships.
Well, certainly there's been reporting on reports out of the intelligence community that Russia, among others, is trying to interfere in the election. But let me ask a more direct question that comes out of the question that was asked by our viewer. Over the last 4 years, is the intelligence community weaker than it was 4 years ago?
Again, it's hard for me to assess weakness. The intelligence community has the greatest impact when its collection is aligned with national security priorities and policymakers can look at that insight and act with greater confidence because we have narrowed ambiguity, or we've provided insight into an advantage, or provided insight, into a way to prevent risk. And as far as I understand, those processes continue to work. But so it's just really hard for me to assess whether we're weaker or not. Obviously there's a tremendous amount out in the press that makes the environment a more fraught one to get up and go to work for every day. But the intelligence community expert, folks that I've talked to said it's just much harder in a COVID environment coping with how to go to work every day than anything they've faced under any administration. So, and that is a reality that every American is actually coping with right now in one way or the other. And intelligence community officers are Americans too. But the execution of secret work in the COVID environment is a complicating thing. So I don't know the answer to that, but I assess just based on my past experience, that the intelligence effort is not weaker, but its utility is greatest when it is really aligned to support the decisions that are being made by the administration. And whether that's taking place or not right now, I can't answer that question.
My own analytic conclusion is that I would not particularly be interested in working on the Russia desk at this point in time. That might not necessarily be greeted with praise. Let me ask, one of the things that was so striking about developing the Bin Laden exhibition and then meeting the folks who were so deeply involved in it was the critical role that women analysts and women intelligence officers played in developing the leads, in really being key people in figuring out what was going on there and creating the analytic framework for this. And, I don't think you'll disagree with that, but let me ask if that is unusual in your experience. You all are, of course, a woman who ran one of the key elements of the entire agency, but is this a change you saw over time? Is this now standard practice or more standard practice within the agency and the intelligence community more broadly?
So the actual work being done by the targeters that, on the Bin Laden raid were officers in the literally from entry level to expert level, on the line analysts, and women. Women were not only a key player in that, but honestly, women have been critically important to some of the biggest espionage hunts. They have been critically important in some of the counterproliferation hunts, and they've been critically important in some of the counter-narcotics support. The targeting profession, which is a very sort of operationally focused, detail-oriented work, I've had people ask me, are women better at that? And I don't know the cognitive scientific answer to that. But I will tell you that, and this is more of a diversity answer, by the way, than an expertise answer, that the agency, I think, is at the forefront of reducing barriers to advancement for all employees. But for decades, targeting, counterespionage work was where a lot of the best and brightest women, both operationally and analytically, went when other paths to advancement were more fraught for women. And some of the women that were critical in doing the Bin Laden work, or some of the early Bin Laden work, had been, in the job for more than 5 years. So in some respects, barriers to advancement have led women to gravitate some of those occupations in the past, and that laid the groundwork for some of that success. There were men very critically involved in the work as well. But note that the senior decision makers, as you moved up that chain of command as to who was briefing the president and who was in, it was the analyst doing the work that were primarily women, but all of the leadership up that chain of command that were in many of these meetings, they were men. So there are certain things I've heard Tish Long, the former director of NGA, say that if there hadn't been women working it, they wouldn't have been able to figure out the number of people that accrued to the laundry on the line. Absolutely believe that. And that's why you want the most diverse set of experiences on any hard problem, because people's life experiences, really do help them interpret information, differently. So might we have not understood that aspect without women? Possibly we would have not made the right calculus of people. But more broadly, I think that some of the reason why the targeting profession has attracted women is because it allowed women to have significant impact on mission in earlier times in the agency's history when it wasn't as easy to advance in some of our directorates.
I'm going to ask if you'll bear with me running a little bit long, but one more question from out there in the audience. And it's a good way to close, actually. Ruta asked, what do you think is the greatest security threat to the U.S. today?
Greatest security threat. So I guess I am concerned that we are still in a period of preoccupation with ourselves. And in the end, there are the international sort of organizations and entities that we've used to diffuse difficult situations do not have the impact that they were having 5 or 10 years ago. We have just a lot of hotspots in the world right now. Nagorno-Karabakh is a good example. Armenia, Azerbaijan. You've got Iran, Turkey, and Russia involved there. You have Iran, Turkey, and Russia involved in Libya. You have, right, in areas where the U.S. might have been a key player, at least in the conversation, where we are not a key player at the moment. Right, so there's a lot of kind of crisis, potential hotspots that could crop up to create everything from human migration to real changes in border security. At the same time, you've got nuclear proliferation, which has not been a top priority for for this administration. You have increasingly adversarial relations with Russia and China, and the U.S., and I'm not sure that changes completely, regardless of who the president is. North Korea, that just rolled out, the biggest ICBM, that they've ever rolled out. And that got so much attention, people barely noticed that they also rolled out a submarine-based missile. So I think that a lot of our traditional threats and risks are out there. But at the same time, there are a lot of regional conflicts that are also emerging. Whether or not we are in the best position to understand those threats and for the U.S. to operationalize strategies to mitigate those threats are probably the things that worries me the most right now, including the long-term implications globally for COVID, of COVID. So I'm sorry, that may not be a very fulfilling answer. It's just such a volatile time. And, people have been talking for 10 years about changing global dynamics, but we're going to wake up from all of this introspection in the US and the world's going to have shifted enormously. And the bad guys have gotten a little badder in that period of time.
Sobering. There was so much more on my list here to talk with you about, but time has flown literally. But I do want to thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating, and it's very clear why you rose as high in the CIA as you did. I want to thank Fran Moore for coming here today, speaking with us. We'll have some more programs that we will announce to you on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I'm Clifford Shannon. Thank you so much, Fran.
Thank you.